It has been said that if you wish to see far ahead in time, you must first look far back to find lessons from the past. The archiving of documents from the past and the present is an important source for architecture and design. It captures the passing of time. It is a testament to the evolution of the discipline. The following masterclasses record the individual processes of professionals and their ways of working.
Good morning, all. My name is Estrella de Diego. I'm professor at the University of Madrid, Universidad Complutense, and I'm academician at the Royal Academy of Arts here in Madrid too. And I'm also a member of the advisory board at the Norman Foster Foundation in the same city. Well, today we're going to discuss archives a bit. Archives as time and as space, taking as a starting point the archives, the beautiful archives at the Norman Foster Foundation, and following up with some artists, contemporary artists who have been working in archives. So, as you probably know, here at the Norman Foster Foundation in Madrid, one can visit and do his or her research in an archive, which is a privileged site since it keeps all documents by Norman Foster, one of the most important architects of 20th and 21st centuries. I dare say that it's a beautiful means to reconstruct Norman Foster's professional and almost personal life, like most archives, personal archives, like in this case. And I would say that Foster is very accurate and very precise, keeping trace of his work. In fact, he started collecting his revealing notebooks from very early in his life. This is, of course, just beautiful to sort of have an approach to his archive and, as I said, to his professional and almost personal life. I would say, as I said before, that archives are about space, since documents are kept in a specific site. And, of course, they're also about time. And in the Norman Foster Foundation archive, time and space mingle as a very precise idea. I would say it's a kind of a customized space and time according to the architect's wishes. And of course, I would say that plans, document, notebooks, so as mentioned before, etc., and this is the originality of the archives, are kept in the foundation itself. So in this respect, it's really a privilege to be able to work here. This is, of course, as all archives, what I would call an information artifact. An information artifact with all the autobiographical narratives, and of course it implies what all autobiographical narratives imply themselves. Of course, there is always a hidden something in the archive. There's always a hidden concept, a hidden document, a hidden narrative again, or a hidden something we have to look for very carefully. And this is one of the most exciting places about archives themselves. In fact, by their own nature, I would say that all archives force researchers into this hidden narrative, which is always wanted to be disclosed. An archive is a number of documents which need us to build up an effective story. Mind you, not truth, not a true story, because truth, of course, is another cultural construction. In this case, like in some of the cases, we are in front of an author's archive. In the case of the Norman Foster Foundation, of course, Norman Foster's archive. And the autobiography readings need from us a careful reading about documents themselves and trying to look for these hidden pages, the hidden pages that are going to be quite efficient for the new story we are going to write. Of course, they're prodigious documents, as I was saying before, notebooks, letters, personal collection, objects, blueprints, etc. And here parts meet and look for wholeness and fragments to constitute a unitary story. I think this is one of the most intriguing and important things about this archive, and I would say archives themselves. Archives are always like a home, and here I'm quoting Jacques Derrida when he's writing Archive Fever, A Freudian Impression, one of the most beautiful texts ever written about archives. a place where there were, he says, this kind of location of documents, time and space again. In this amazing text, French philosopher wonders about the new role of archives in a hyper-informed society. This is again something extremely interesting about archives today. The text is early 1990s, 1995 to be more precise. And of course, lots of different things have happened in this over 20 years, lots of important things about this hyper-informed society. If archives, as I was saying before, are spaces for displacement and dislocations in which divergent parts find a unitary locus in a residence, a domicile, he says, how can one create a philosophy of archives and preservation in a hyper-informed society like ours, even today more than the moment when Derrida wrote his text? How has the notion of public and private been transformed? Very radically, I would say. Private and public as very slippery concepts when in an archives itself try to find the way out or the way in, I would say. Let me quote 1 second Jacques Derrida text. Especially, those things related to the notion of memory, which is, again, a very important idea when talking about archives. And more precisely, when talking about trying to find one's way around archives. And this is a quote from Derrida. It is thus, in this domicilialization, in this house arrest, that archives take place. The dwelling, this place where they dwell permanently, marks this institutional passage from private to the public, which does not always mean from the secret to the non-secret. They inhabit this unusual space, the place of election, where law and singularity intersect in privilege, end quote. At this point, of course, I'm thinking about Freud's archive collection in Vienna and then later in London, where his museums are open today. A house like a collection of antiques, a collection of documents, because they were very much related to his own research as a psychoanalyst, or the father of psychoanalysis, I would say. To a certain extent, his collection acts like an archive. We always remember this table where he had all these different little sculptures that to a certain extent were like patients to him. He was actually working on psychoanalysis in front of this collection of little statues. As I said, it's a kind of a sort of an archive that has been disclosed or unclosed. I'm not quite sure about Freud's museum in London, in front of his collection, whether it's secret or non-secret, as Derrida points out in his text. And of course, they're related to privilege, that very act of conforming a residence, Derrida points out too. But of course, as we all know, classifying is never innocent at all. What to classify? Why and how classifying? The questions are very slippery right now. I think they have always been very slippery. And, looking at Freud's collection, it's pretty obvious they're extremely slippery. What about what should we preserve in the age of Instagram, internet, Google time, etc., etc.? How should we classify? Even more important than that, how can we confront the very act of archiving, finding a residue for documents in this era of hypercommunication we're going through? It seems that those are essential questions today when facing an archive, and probably when starting what I would call an archival mission. Okay, besides the scholar approach in an archive, should always have a very humble attitude. A humble attitude is required when facing any autobiographical archive or artifact. And I think archives are always autobiographical artifacts in a more obvious way when they're an author's archive, like in this case, but always archive. It has some autobiography implied in it. Visiting an archive and doing research in an archive is always a personal experience, I would say. The private and the public tend to melt in a paradoxical way. Yet, on the other hand, order is always discriminating and ranking. this is another contradiction, apparently contradiction for archives. Different orders create different narratives. That is the case of the museum in Beauvoir and Pécuchet. When they start a museum, in the beautiful Flaubert's book, they start a museum and they start ranking and classifying, and then they realize all things they had were not as exciting as they thought before the actual classifying and ranking. That is the reason why archive is always something autobiographical, something private, something non-public, something secret. And of course, the public becomes, or the private becomes public, and then private again. And in this process, time and space need a strong negotiation, as I was saying before. Of course, the residence selected is crucial too, not only in this place, but, when trying where to place a document, to start classification, or at least trying to establish some ranking of documents. In the last decades, as I said before, archives have become cultural artifacts, no doubt about that. And the concept of document has expanded its meanings and usages. This is one of the most exciting things that have been taking place about artists and archives in the last decades. A good example is Mexican artist Erick Beltran. He's probably working on a way that could be classified and anti-enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the invention of encyclopedia, is invention of archives, and to a certain extent, Beauvoir and Pécuchet are making some fun of this idea. So, as a matter of fact, Erick Beltran, Mexican artist, invents a kind of an anti-Larousse dictionary. And this classifying is an anti-classifying, or a new order of classification. Archives are a validation of a document and the very idea of truth and authenticity. But what is really truth and what is authenticity? How can we preserve an archive and documents in an archive when truth and authenticity are sort of reread and revisited in the last years? Needless to explain that, of course, authenticity is pretty much related to not only to a cultural agreement, testimony, truth, etc., but authenticity is again related to race, and is related to gender, and is related to sexual options, etc., etc. That is the most exciting things that have been taking place in the last years. Therefore, one has to look for new genealogies. Lauren O'Grady, in fact, was devising, working from archival images, both personal and public, family photographs from her dead sister, plus images from old Egypt, and she's sort of facing them, as you can see. And of course, the idea is that it's creating a new African genealogy that is related to Egypt, to an older civilization. I think it's very intriguing the way she works from personal and public archives, like many other artists. Bernice Sabot was working all the time about archival works, not only in her images. This is Age portrait, pretty much related to Bertillon and the idea of a double portrait describing the life of a person. But she was working on classifying New York, inventing an archive for New York City to her photographs. In this respect, the idea of documents and documenting, and the meaning of document itself, always as a slippery territory that needs to be interpreted when facing an archive. Let me go for a second to Lidia Cabrera, the anthropologist and writer born in Cuba, who was working in Paris in the 1920s. And in Paris, she discovers Cuba as a prodigious roots she has to look for. Of course, she was a bourgeois. She came from a bourgeois family. But of course, in Paris, she discovers the idea of Black Cuba. And she starts looking for, she goes back to the island. And she starts looking for new material. And she writes one of the most amazing books ever written, which is called El Monte, The Wild Nurse. And it's a mid-50s book. And in this book, she worked pretty much trying to select and trying to interpret all testimonies from native people about historical rituals, anthropological rituals, etc. And it's so exciting because, of course, fiction and fact mingle in her book. And one has the impression that although, well, she's given voice to lots of different people she's actually interviewing. And this is a kind of choral book she's writing where everybody gives ideas and everybody gives testimonies. She's writing the book, but one has the impression that lots of other people, lots of other voices are contributing to her book. So she's doing, to a certain extent, a kind of an archival work, a kind of an archival research, and puts that in a book. But the most exciting thing about Lidia Cabrera, that to me is pretty much related to the work archives, or the way archives interpret authenticity and truth, is that when she's writing fiction, one has the impression that she's writing anthropology, understanding anthropology as something pretty much related to archival work, oral history, but no matter what, archival work. And when she's doing anthropology, one has the impression she's actually working about some kind of literary approach. Again, truth or fact and fiction again mingle in a very exciting way in Lidia Cabrera's work. Later in 1970s, she goes with her partner, Josefina Tarafa, they were together for most of their lives. And she goes back to Cuba. She goes back to documenting hidden Cuba, as you can see in the images of her book, the book they wrote together. And again, she makes this kind of double archive, narrative and images for that archive that becomes, again, extremely interesting in the respect of archives. But not only Cuban anthropologist Lidia Cabrera is working on this archival approach to reality or to oral history. Sophie Cole, French artist, is sort of devising a fake, non-fake archive, where she's working on Detective, a work of 1981. Everybody remembers, she asked her mother to look for a private eye to follow her around the city, and she makes this kind of, these real documents, fake documents, and she rewrites a story with fake and true documents, fact and fiction, private and public documents, inventing a new life for herself, more exciting probably than that the private eye had discovered following her around the city. Another good example about this personal, non-personal, familiar, non-familiar use of archival strategies is, of course, Christian Boltanski. Well, of course, he's a Jewish boy who was growing in Paris, in the post-war Paris, and he claims he doesn't have a history, doesn't have a proud family history, so he buys a family album, and with all these strangers, photographs, he makes a story for himself. I said, okay, no matter what, I don't have a history myself, a family history, I will invent it. In fact, all versions of reality, all testimonies talking about different ways of realities, Cole or the other artists, to me, I pretty much like about the essence of an archive, that essence I was talking about before, the impossibility to classify without working around paradoxes. This is the quality of archival artifacts. And of course, again, the idea that in the best archives, there is always something missing. I would say in life, there's always something missing. In all good narratives, there's always something missing. In fact, I'm thinking now again about Sophie Cole, when she makes photographs, a documentary kind of visual archive about Isabella Gardner Museum. There were some thieves, unfortunately, of some of the pieces, and instead of changing the plays. She makes photographs, and then she writes testimonies of some people remembering what the piece was like, etc., etc. Is the idea of that which is missing in an archive, that sacred, non-sacred. Derrida is implying in his text. Another example of an artist working from archival strategies is, of course, Russian artist Ilya Kabakov. I'm thinking of my mother's album, The Corridor, which is a work, an installation from 1919. And well, he discloses some of her mother's own private photographs, very little number of them, since they had to run from Russia when the Germans actually entered the country. And of course, you know, propagandistic propaganda, Russian propaganda documents, and he confronts them. Artus Bispo de Rosario, Mark Dion, Manuel Montalvo, all these artists that to a certain extent work in this anti-archival strategies, or, you know, they sort of taking the collection and collecting as an archival strategy, and they make their own works imitating that archival strategies. In the case of Artur Vivo and Manuel Montalvo, are artists that could be called vernacular artists. And it's interesting the use of repetition they have, which is very pretty much into the archival actual strategy. Collecting, recollecting, it's a way to harvest. It's like, you know, people working in a harvest, which is trying to sort of find a new narrative, and of course a new strategy, and of course new forms of secret in this kind of domicile about time and space. I would like to go back to Andy Warhol, and I'm finishing right away. Well, of course, I mean, the archive of Warhol is it's pretty much and very well known, actually, because he usually collected some bits and pieces in boxes. And so this idea of unbox and to the act of unboxing is pretty much related to Warhol archive. For a while, these boxes were never opened. The strategy when open the boxes is very slow, like an archive. One has to classify every single document in the box, etc., etc. And you know, now at the museum, those are some of the bits and pieces into these famous time boxes are now you know, shown to the general public in a kind of an archive that can be visited by the general public, and of course, if you get into their homepage at the museum at Pittsburgh, you can get your own time box, you know, your own Warhol's time box from your mobile phone, which is, you know, by a joke, kind of a joke, or a creative act, which is called Unboxed. You put together all bits and pieces, as Andy Warhol was doing in his boxes. Of course, now visitors, as I said before, can engage in an artist process. So this is what the homepage says. Now visitors to the Warhol Museum can engage in the artist process and create in time capsules with a 21st century twist. Last week, we launched Unboxed, a mobile experience that allows visitors to digitally collect the artworks that pique their interest. It's a kind of a portable article, and it's a kind of a portable archive. In their respect, of course, I'm not going to quote the famous Boîte à Malice by Marcel Duchamp, very well known, which is a kind of an in between a museum and an archive, because it's sort of used in reproductions. Those documents, all those documents, need us to complete their narrative. And this is the important and most exciting thing about archives. Is a case of Warburg. Every time I go to Warburg Institute, they were collecting photographs, images, documents, etc. Just like in the beautiful Norman Foster Foundation, the beautiful notebooks that create the archive's own life. And this is the most exciting thing about it. Those documents, as I said before, need us to complete the narrative. They need us to rewrite their story. So let me finish today with another Derrida's quote. There's no archive without a place of consignation, without a technique of repetition, and without a certain exteriority. No archive without outside, says and writes French philosopher. So I will finish today with this beautiful image again. This is André Malraux and his Museum Without Walls. Before the internet, there was internet, and he was trying to reclassify the whole art history and to revisit archives with the new classification. It seems a beautiful image to end up this little conversation we had today. So I want to thank you for your attention and wish you a very pleasant day.